Andrew Gamble will not need much introduction, I suspect, to many of you. He's been a towering figure in British political economy for a generation. Andrew first came to the University of Sheffield in 1973. He helped to found and then was later director of Sheffield's Political Economy Research Centre and later served as Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the university. In 2007, he was appointed Professor of Politics at the University of Cambridge and then the founding head of its new Department of Politics and International Studies. He returned to Sheffield in 2014 and is now both Professor of Politics and a Professorial Fellow at SPERI. Andrew is a Fellow of the British Academy and the Academy of Social Sciences and has been an influential editor of both New Political Economy and Political Quarterly. In 2005, Andrew was awarded the Isaiah Berlin Prize for lifetime contribution to political studies. Throughout his career, Andrew has made seminal contributions both to our understanding of British political economy and of the historical, institutional and ideological context which have shaped it, and to the wider doctrines of political economy and their relationships to the ideologies of the modern era. His analysis of Margaret Thatcher's governments, the free economy and the strong state, provided the first and still the most compelling account of the political economy of that period, the first flourishing of what today we might call neoliberalism. His analysis of the work of Friedrich Hayek, The Iron Cage of Liberty, remains the most insightful and accessible survey of that complex thinker. As early as 2003, his book Between Europe and America, The Future of British Politics, was presciently unpicking the UK's troubled relationship with both the EU and the US. In 2009, just a year after the financial crash, he was analysing its causes and implications in The Spectre at the Feast, Capitalist Crisis and the Politics of Recession. By 2014, he was prophetically warning of crisis without end, the unravelling of Western prosperity. You can see here a pattern of insight into what was going on much earlier than most others. And as if in summation, his most recent book, published earlier this year, is called Politics, Why It Matters. It is an acutely insightful account of precisely that, why politics matters. At a time of unprecedented economic and political turmoil, his reflections could not be more important. We're honoured to have Andrew give the keynote lecture this morning. His title is Beyond Brexit, the Past and Future of the UK Political Economy. Andrew Gamble.
Well, thanks very much. It's just as well we're not having this conference in Sheffield, because if we were, we'd be underwater. So that's one mercy. My theme is the Beyond Brexit, the past and future of the UK political economy. The general election to be held on December the 12th is already being hailed as the most important election since Thatcher's win in 1979, an election which will decide the future direction of the country for at least a generation and reshape its political economy. But will it? As Colin Hay has recently observed, social scientists can never know enough to be able to make accurate predictions. What they can do is make events intelligible retrospectively. But if we cannot predict, we can hope to clarify the range of possible outcomes and the constraints on realising them. Fundamental change requires much more than the securing of one electoral majority. The implementation of a radical policy in government is long and difficult and only ultimately successful when the opposition accepts the changes as legitimate. That can take several electoral cycles to achieve. It is easy to point to outcomes which in retrospect might make the 2019 election a turning point. Conservative majority and a radical Brexit, a Labour majority and a radical economic transformation, and increased majority of the SNP and the breakup of the UK after a second independence referendum. But none of these flow inevitably from the election result. Huge uncertainties remain as to how events will unfold. It is also possible the Westminster election ends in another stalemate, another hung parliament, which could prevent anything very radical happening in any direction. The Conservatives enter the election as strong favourites, but their chances hinge on uniting Leave voters behind them, squeezing out the Brexit Party and taking advantage of the fragmentation of the Remain vote between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. The problem for the Conservatives is that one general election victory will not resolve the Brexit debate, because while it will ensure that the UK formally leaves the EU, it will not determine the kind of Brexit the Conservatives are either able or willing to deliver. Since the referendum in 2016, there have been numerous assessments by economists of the short-term impacts of different forms of Brexit on the UK economy, including WTO rules, Norway, Canada Plus, and several others, including the two deals actually reached with the EU. Most of these assessments, including those from the Treasury, the Bank of England, the IMF, and the OECD, have concluded that the UK economy would be significantly worse off compared to staying in the EU. The recent NIESR assessment, for example, forecasts that the Johnson deal will be more damaging than the May deal and will cost the UK 70 billion or 4% of GDP by the end of the 2020s. Brexiters have always disputed such findings, either labelling them a continuation of Project Fear or putting forward models with different assumptions to show that Brexit will bring a step change to the British economy and a new era of prosperity and growth. Others have disputed the worth of these projections altogether, arguing that no one can be sure how producers and consumers will respond to any particular form of Brexit over the next 10 or 20 years. If the future is radically unknowable, it is better not to speculate. This lecture asks rather different questions. How does Brexit fit within a longer historical perspective of the evolution of the UK political economy? And how might different kinds of Brexit affect the position of the UK in the international order and the configuration of its dominant Anglo-liberal model? What do different kinds of Brexit imply for the rules governing movement of goods, services, money, and people? Will they be relatively open or relatively closed? And will their different growth models be primarily market-led or state-led? British politics has often been discussed primarily in terms of conflicts over the role of the state in the economy, liberalism versus collectivism, capitalism versus socialism. The substantive issues of the UK political economy are seen to revolve around domestic issues. The conflict between capital and labour in the 20th century was represented as an adversarial struggle between class-based parties over the control of production and the distribution of the national wealth. Key general elections in this period include 1918, the first universal suffrage election, which saw Labour's decisive breakthrough to become one of the leading parties of the state, 1931, the decisive rout of the Labour Party after its second period of minority government, and the consolidation of all anti-Labour forces behind the Conservatives, 1945, the first majority Labour government and the implementation of a social democratic settlement in the UK, and 1979, Thatcher's breaking of the 1970s impasse and the undoing of that settlement. But important though these conflicts were, they always occurred within a broader context, the political economic choices about Britain's place in the world and its connections with the wider international political economy. In the last 200 years, there have been three such fundamental turning points in the UK political economy, each preceded by a long period of political debate and political conflict. Assuming Brexit is finally delivered in the next few years in some form, possibly, I know, a heroic assumption, 2016 may come to be seen as a fourth fundamental turning point, joining 1846, the repeal of the Corn Laws, which ushered in the free trade era and the zenith of British power, 1931, the collapse of the gold standard, when Britain finally lost its supremacy and embraced protectionism to defend its empire, and 1973, the accession to the European Community, when Britain accepted that its economic future lay in pooling sovereignty with its European partners. 1846 saw the final triumph of free trade and economic liberalism over the protection of agricultural interests, confirming the establishment of a liberal international economic and commercial order under British leadership. 1931 marked the final collapse of that order and that leadership and the triumph domestically of the forces of national protection and social imperialism. seeking to preserve and defend the British Empire from external attack. 1973 recognised that the empire was no more and proposed engagement with the process of European integration and a European future for Britain. National political economies display a high degree of path dependency, and the institutions and cultures they acquire through a long evolution are resistant to change. Britain cannot easily change many of the inherited characteristics of its political economy, the Anglo-liberal model, such as its early urbanisation, its dependence on global trade and investment, the size and importance of its financial sector, the decline of the once mighty manufacturing sector despite continuing clusters of industrial excellence, the persistent low level of investment in infrastructure, skills and education, the priority given to shareholder value over stakeholder value, its hybrid welfare state, its dependence on consumer debt to fuel growth, or its high immigration and flexible labour markets. These characteristics embedded in institutions and cultures limit the possibilities of radical new directions, but do not exclude them altogether. There are still important choices which are bitterly contested and where the outcomes are significant for the future trajectory of the British economy. The path beyond Brexit is one of those important choices. The referendum result in 2016 reopens the European commitment Britain made in 1973. A number of different futures became possible, but it is not yet certain which will be chosen and whether the one that is chosen initially can be sustained. Brexit has polarised opinion to such an extent that it is contributing to a major realignment of political loyalties and electoral politics around the two camps of Leave and Remain, which have markedly different demographic and geographical characteristics and represent very different political, economic interests, cultures and political identities. One of the reasons British politics has been at such an impasse is that the form the referendum took, allowing Leave to be interpreted in several different ways, settled only the question of membership, not the future relationship. 3.5 years have been spent finalising a withdrawal agreement which can pass Parliament. The hard part, the trade negotiation, lies ahead. It is still a blank sheet of paper apart from the vague aspirations set down in the political declaration. There are 4 broad possible futures for the UK political economy beyond Brexit. The first 2 accept the existing Anglo-liberal model but seek to steer it in different directions. The second 2 reject key aspects of the Anglo-liberal model and seek a radical rupture from it. These futures are best seen as 4 possible paths. They are presented here as distinct, although there may be some overlap in practice, because political coalitions often attempt, at least discursively, to follow more than one path at once in their search for support and legitimacy. The first future, and perhaps the most one best known, is global Britain, or Singapore-on-Thames. Whatever their disagreements, such as exactly when is Brexit, most of the leaders of Leave, from Nigel Farage to Steve Baker to Boris Johnson, subscribe to some version of global Britain. This path aims for a much looser relationship with the EU, meaning as a minimum substantial and increasing regulatory and customs divergence and the weakening of other ties. The UK is positioned instead in the international economy as a low-tax, light regulation jurisdiction, able to trade freely and take commercial opportunities wherever they arise. This is justified with the argument that Europe is a declining part of the international economy and the UK will be more able to trade with high-growth sectors in the rest of the world if it is free to conduct its own independent trade policy rather than collaborating with the EU. Global Britain suggests a British economy even more open, apart from its relationship to the EU, to the free movement of goods, services, money and people than it is currently. This greater openness could be realised through a unilateral free trade policy, as proposed by Patrick Minford, which would dispense with the need for trade agreements altogether, or by relying on WTO rules as favoured by Nigel Lawson and many in the ERG, or by negotiating a free trade agreement with the EU following an orderly departure, as favoured by Boris Johnson. Either of these last two would in principle allow trade agreements with as many other jurisdictions as possible. In practice, these would be most likely negotiated with other countries in the Anglosphere, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. A free trade deal with the rising powers of Asia, such as China or India, would look much more difficult. Whether the ultimate choice is unilateral free trade or WTO rules, untangling EU supply chains and trading relationships will undoubtedly cause an economic shock and a hit to living standards and jobs. But this is acceptable to Brexiters if it is the catalyst for a significant restructuring of the UK economy, pushing the Anglo-liberal model further in a deregulatory direction, resuming the journey that was interrupted after Thatcher's fall in 1990. Sectors like cars and agriculture will be big losers, along with all sectors strongly integrated over the last 40 years into the EU. The gainers will be those service sectors who can adapt their business model to new opportunities outside the EU or who already have such a model anyway. Gainers also will be consumers as prices for some items, particularly food, tumble. Britain will regain control over its immigration policy in the sense of no longer allowing European citizens to have free movement, but immigration from all parts of the world will have to remain high to preserve a flexible labour market. There will be few resources to fund higher public spending, since taxes as a whole will be reduced and growth will be lower. Investment and productivity will also take a hit, inequality will widen. The main brunt of this restructuring, paradoxically, would be borne by many of the areas which voted leave, many of which fell behind during the last great restructuring in the 1980s, which sharply increased regional inequality. The areas which voted remain would be best placed to adjust and prosper. To win former Labour and Brexit Party Leave voters over to their side, the Conservatives are promising large increases in public spending directed at the NHS, education and policing. They want to rebalance spending away from London, revitalising Wales, the Midlands, the North and the East Coast. But such policies will be difficult to reconcile with a hard Brexit, so either the Conservatives will have to put their new electoral coalition at risk, or they will pivot inexorably to a much softer Brexit, accepting the level playing field Brussels will demand to protect existing jobs, standards and rights. But for many Brexiters, this would be Brexit in name only, the worst of all worlds. Whether the choice of global Britain can lead to a radical restructuring depends on how far a government committed rhetorically to global Britain is willing or able to push for divergence from the EU after Brexit. It will need to balance the desire of Brexiters for a radical Brexit and a restructuring of the economy with the expectations and interests of many of the Leave voters who now form the Conservative support base and who want very different things from Brexit. The second future is European Britain, or Social Democratic Britain. This path unites the various strands of Remain opinion. Despite their many differences, they all support a continuing close relationship with the EU, whether this takes the form of revoking Article 50 straight away, or revoking it after a second referendum, or of a deal which effectively keeps Britain in the EU customs union and clearly aligned to the single market. Such policies aim at minimising the damage of Brexit or at avoiding it altogether. A European Britain makes independent trade deals either impossible or much more limited. It means accepting that the primary interests of the UK political economy are bound up with its links to the EU, built up over the last 4 decades. Britain remains very much within the EU's orbit. Deals with other countries are possible, but only as part of a deal negotiated by the EU, such as those concluded recently with Japan and Canada. William Waldegrave has argued recently that the role Britain could occupy beyond Brexit would be the role Canada plays in relation to the US. Britain would be closely tied to the EU, constantly adjusting its relationship to it, but not a part of its decision-making structures. Such a vision of Britain's future role suggests a relatively small change to the UK's political economy and Britain's place in the world. It has, after all, always been a semi-detached member of the EU, often unwilling to commit to deeper integration and negotiating opt-outs. In mitigating the costs of Brexit in this way, the UK would also miss out on the potential benefits of a much looser relationship, and it would remain firmly within the orbit of the EU, committed to multilateral cooperation and the upholding of the rules-based international order. European Britain would not depart radically from the Anglo-liberal model, but the direction would be different from global Britain. It would favour higher public spending, higher taxation, greater regulation, inclusive growth, and action to tackle climate change. The growth model would be state-led rather than market-led to promote investment in infrastructure, education, and skills. The third future is the Green New Deal, or Red-Green Britain. This path, like the next one, implies a significant rupture with both the Anglo-liberal model and Britain's relationship to the international economy. Brexit is regarded as an opportunity for a radical transformation which should be seized, although many of its advocates, by no means all, back continuing membership of the EU, which they want to reform. Another Europe is possible. But in relation to the wider international economy, there is opposition to existing free movement of goods and of capital because they want to limit the power of corporations and banks. Although there is support for free movement of people and international cooperation, and little support for the traditional national protectionism of the left. The Green New Deal, like the other paths, is not a single programme, but a spectrum. It is anti-austerity, anti-globalisation, in some of its formulations anti-capitalist, but also anti-nationalist and pro-immigration. The distinctive feature of this path is its new growth model. Growth should only continue if it can be made sustainable. This implies a far-reaching transformation of the political economy through major state-led investment in new technologies and ways of living to make a decarbonised economy feasible. It requires an interventionist entrepreneurial state to enable a shift to a decentralised, non-hierarchical economy answerable directly to local communities, with financial services and corporate capital reorganised to support a local sharing everyday economy and a radical redistribution of wealth. Part of the debate over the Green New Deal is how far it should work through markets and how far it should replace markets. To succeed, any such strategy would need a deep base of popular support, and that in turn would need an economy which continued to function and deliver for the mass of its citizens. To establish and sustain this path, cooperation from large parts of the business community would be needed, otherwise it could be derailed through investment strikes, runs on the pound, and falling tax revenues. The need to maintain both business support and popular support may temper the radicalism of the project. Like a radical Brexit, one election would not be sufficient to embed it as the new direction of the UK political economy. The fourth future is Protectionist Britain, or Fortress Britain. This path would see the re-emergence of protectionism as the lodestar of UK political economy. Protectionist Britain would be the most closed of the four paths, being anti-globalist, anti-free trade, and anti-immigration, as well as anti-EU and anti-multilateral institutions and the rules-based international order. This path is the least developed of the four and not well represented in the political debate, although elements of it, such as anti-immigration, are already very strong. It might become more important, especially if Brexit was cancelled altogether or if global Britain led to a radical economic shock. This path seeks a complete break from the EU, but is opposed to globalism, free trade, and all forms of free movement. Any trade deals would be bilateral deals. Support might come from those most adversely affected by Brexit, particularly in the older industrial areas, and made angry by the failure of Brexit paths like global Britain to protect their interests by not safeguarding existing jobs and by not reducing levels of immigration. Many voted leave expecting their interests to be protected through much stricter controls on immigration and through safeguarding of existing jobs, implying trade and capital controls, while preserving universal programs of the welfare state, such as health, education and pensions. Protectionist Britain would be populist and nationalist, anti-establishment and anti-elites. It is unlikely to capture either the Conservative or the Labour Party as presently constituted, so to be successful would need a new political vehicle. Protectionist Britain would be a radical break from the dominant discourses and traditions of the UK political economy in the recent past. America First may have some resonance in the United States with its vast continental economy, but Britain First is harder to envisage now that Britain no longer has an empire and has to trade globally to support its large population. Yet national protectionism was very strong for several decades in the 20th century after the political victory of tariff reformers and social imperialists in 1931, and was also strong within the labour movement, most recently in the alternative economic strategy of the 1970s and 1980s. Could it be again? The world is currently in danger of fragmenting once more into rival economic and military blocs. Britain is no longer big enough to be a bloc on its own and is disengaging from the EU, and it is not obvious which other bloc it could join. The logic for protectionists might be to advocate rejoining the EU and linking up with populist nationalist parties there, but that does not at present seem very likely. To conclude, the four paths outlined above indicate very different paths for the UK political economy. Which of these choices is realised depends in part on which political forces prevail in the internal political struggle, but it also depends crucially on what happens to the international economy and the rivalry of the great powers, and whether or not at some stage there is a renewed financial crisis and another major recession. Another key factor is what happens to the EU. Does it become more integrated and cohesive? Does it become increasingly a set of concentric circles with different levels of membership? Or does it break up? The future of the EU and the US-China rivalry have huge implications for what kind of future beyond Brexit is realised for the UK. What is clear from the aftermath of the Brexit vote is that the country remains evenly divided, its divisions more entrenched, and little sign of any significant movement in public opinion which might resolve the impasse. There is a passionate minority on both sides which is making a compromise hard to find. The polarisation of opinion between Leave and Remain means that any new consensus on Britain's place in the world may not be realised quickly, but may take several general elections to resolve. Any settlement may be challenged and a new cycle of adversarial politics initiated, in which parties of Leave seek to diverge from Europe while parties of Remain seek to converge with it. Unless a major new economic and political upheaval gives an opportunity to one of the two radical options, the initial path of the UK political economy beyond Brexit is likely to be still recognisably Anglo-liberal. But the central choice that is made in political economic terms between Europe and America, which has bedeviled British politics for 3 decades, will determine what kind of Anglo-liberal model it is to be. Thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Right, we're going to take some questions. We started a little bit late, so we've got a little bit less time than we originally wanted, but who would like to ask a question or make a comment? Anybody would like to do so?
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Simon Moen from Queen Mary. It was interesting that you didn't once mention, I think, anything about finance or financialisation or anything like that in thinking about possible future directions for the British economy and its relation with the rest of the world. I wonder if you could just comment on that.
We'll take a few. So the gentleman just on the row end behind, thank you.
Hello, my name's Adam Feinberg. I'm wondering what Professor Gamble thinks about the huge shift by 2 people retiring Labour MPs yesterday, switching all the way from the Labour Party to Boris Johnson's Conservative Party.
Anyone else? Gentleman here? Okay.
Hi, I was interested in the idea of global Britain. I wonder to what extent you think global Britain is now hegemonic within the Conservative Party, or whether there are still kind of significant forces of resistance to that which could emerge in the wake of whatever happens in the election.
Okay, let's take one more. The lady here. Yep.
Liliana Pop. I was just interested, thinking about 2010 and the austerity, was that a shift? Because it seems to have come in an arbitrary manner, the Conservatives and their coalition and whatever. Other options were possible. They took this path, and now here we are.
Okay, great. Andrew, do you want to take these?
Okay, well, yeah, yes, there was, I didn't talk very much about finance and financialisation, although it is implicit in as a key aspect of the Anglo-liberal model that finance is extremely important, and also for the two radical options. The question of what to do about finance is central to their political economy. So I think that the interesting thing about finance in relation to global Britain is that the city takes a hit from Brexit, there's no doubt about it, in relation to the EU, but the city is large enough and flexible enough that many elements of a city see opportunities elsewhere to develop. So the city would have to readjust, but the city has often readjusted in its long history. But I think there is the future of the City of London, and whether it is the part which it is going to play, is a critical element in all these four options, and in a longer version that would have to be explored. On the little local difficulties that the Labour Party is experiencing, Ian Austin and John Woodcock are, of course, they gave up the Labour whip some time ago, but it is symptomatic that both the major political parties have suffered and are still in the process of undergoing deep splits, and this is part of the fundamental realignment of British politics, which is going on, which is far from complete, and quite where the parties are going to end up, and what kind of party system we have, I think is very hard. It's very hard to judge, but these are huge signs, just as figures like Kenneth Clarke and Michael Heseltine in the Conservative Party recommending votes for the Liberal Democrats. So I think this is something which is going to develop still further. The parties are both major parties are on a long journey. On global Britain, I think, and the Conservative Party, the Conservative Party is clearly shedding a large, very significant part of its pro-European wing. The number of Conservatives that have either left the party altogether or who are standing down as MPs means that the pro-European wing in the Conservative Party after this election will be very much smaller. But I think that doesn't necessarily mean that the Conservative Party pursues one of the extreme version of global Britain. That's a possibility. But it's also a possibility that the Conservative Party, should it win a majority, actually tacks back towards a soft Brexit. Which is the reason why Nigel Farage will not support one of the reasons, at any rate, he will not support the Conservative Party at this election. So I think that within the Conservative Party, there's still an awful lot to play for, because the costs of actually a hard Brexit are very real and are borne in on ministers, and the temptation to conclude a much softer Brexit with the EU, to get a trade deal which is with the EU to get it quickly, would indicate that the party in government might shift in that direction. But I think that's going to be, again, it depends on the size of the majority, if the Conservatives do have a majority after the election, as to how that is then fought out within the cabinet and within the government. And finally, the question on austerity. I didn't quite catch the sense of it. That
Was 2010 really an important break moment?
2010, right? Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yes. 2010 was very important because the coalition government committed Britain to an economic policy which required a high level of austerity, a very big cutback in public spending. I mean, the political economic choice that was made in 2010, which was very different from the choice made by most other European countries. So that any government would have had to deal with the contraction of the economy, and therefore the shortfall in the public finances. But there were a series of different choices that could be made. The choice that the British government made was to have 80% of the adjustment fell on spending. That was the plan, and 20% on tax increases. In the actual event, I think it was more closer to 90% on spending. So, but whereas some other countries, some of the Nordic countries, did it the other way around. And I think the politics of austerity, the political economy of austerity, shows that there were real choices in 2010 as to which way you did it. The coalition government in 2010 chose a particular pattern, and that contributed to what some people call the lost decade.
I'm going to take two more, because we're going to run slightly out of time. Dan, did you want to do one here? And then, are there any women in the audience who would like to ask a question? There's a lady back there I'm going to take, and then you can have your go Mahan thing. Yeah, please do, Dan.
Andrew, thanks ever so much. I was intrigued by your suggestion that we need to take Brexit in the longue durée, and you're going back as far as 1846. I wonder if that is still possible, given that in 1846 Britain was extremely important and our decisions mattered, and same in 1931. But now, as you also pointed out, capitalism is about consumer debt, and the US and China are much more significant. And could we, in fact, still have moments as significant as those earlier ones in the present day?
On the end of the row there.
Oh, hi, I'm Judith Ward from Sustainability First. Thanks very much for that. Just to ask really, in a way, the pitch on which politics now plays out around the world is radically different in terms of communications and the speed of communications. And I'm just wondering, in a way, whether that has the potential to impact if, you know, the outcomes you've described differently.
Andrew.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think that's a really interesting question about turning points, and I think, yes, undoubtedly Britain is much more constrained now than it was back in the 19th century. But I think there still are some very important choices and directions. But certainly the political economy, the constraints are very strong. So that though in rhetoric people imagine very different futures, the actual practicalities means that what is possible is much more limited. And I think, yeah, so communications and well, I think it's even more than that. I think it's the whole speed up of all the ways in which we communicate and the IT revolution and so on. I mean, our world is changing so rapidly and so quickly and in ways which we don't properly understand. And so I think, yes, that's going to be an increasingly important part. And this election, the way that parties compete for votes is just one small aspect of that. So, yes, I'd agree.
Okay, I'm going to close this because we've got another panel to go to. Can I say thank you very much indeed to Andrew Gamble for kicking us off in that way, and we'll move on to the next panel. So thank you very much indeed, Andrew.